And we are live. Welcome to another episode of the New York Information Security Meetup, the largest independent security group in the country. Thanks very much for joining us today. I have the great pleasure to introduce Naveen Sunkavally, who is the Chief Architect for Horizon 3. Thanks very much for joining, Naveen. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me.
So this conversation today is a continuation of a session we had on December 17th, where we discussed the Log4j, Log4S vulnerability. And what's interesting is that, so we'll jump into your background and why we have you today, why should people listen to you. But before we do that, I want to kind of discuss the fact that typically when there's, when you throw a rock like the Log4j into the pond and make some waves, and there's a lot of feedback from professionals, and then things kind of die out. It's not really the case here. So we'll cover some of the areas of what has been done so far by security professionals to basically reduce the vulnerability, the exposure to the Log4j. But then we'll discuss some best practices and so on. But so we kind of have the continuation from the conversation from December 17th. So Naveen, before we get started, and I see we have Snehal Antani as well, the Chief Executive Officer for Horizon 3. Welcome.
Likewise, and you're in great hands with Naveen.
Thank you very much.
Let me get evil villain look going for this podcast.
So yeah, we'll have you join us as well in the conversation. But before we get started, I wanted to just introduce Naveen. You have a tremendous background. You've been doing some great work in the cybersecurity space for quite some time. So why don't we jump into just a conversation about your background, where you came from, and so on.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a software engineer at heart, and I've been doing software engineering for 20 years, focused specifically on enterprise security products and services, design, development, architecture, and so forth. Started in the data loss prevention space at a startup called Vontu. Then spent many years at RSA Security in a variety of different problem domains, identity management, network forensics, risk and compliance, and so forth. And it was my time there I started getting really deep into offensive security. So about 2 years ago, I joined Horizon 3 as a founding engineer. And here I'm 100% focused on building Node Zero, which is our autonomous pen testing product. So day to day, my time is spent working on offensive security tooling, automating attacker techniques, writing and testing exploits, and a lot of vulnerability research. So that's what I do.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And Snehal, since you joined, maybe a quick introduction for those who are not familiar with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Snehal. Excuse me. Snehal Antani. I'm the co-founder and CEO here at Horizon 3. I get to work with brilliant folks like Naveen, and about a third of the company are former U.S. Special Operations, National Security, offensive cyber experts. And the other 2/3 are startup engineers like Naveen, and blending these two worlds together to build autonomous pen testing. My background, I was a CIO at GE Capital. I was the CTO at Splunk, and then took a break from industry to serve within special operations, where I met my co-founder, Tony, and he and I hatched this plan to start Horizon 3, and Naveen was one of the first people we brought into the company.
Perfect. So for those who do not have the ability to join on December 17th, I highly recommend that you go back and view that. That was with Snehal and Tony, where we discussed the Log4j. But maybe we can jump into a quick primer, Naveen, about the Log4j and Log4S shell to see, just for those folks that are not, completely familiar with, just so we bring everybody kind of on the same page.
Yeah, sure. So Log4Shell is a vulnerability in the Apache Log4j2 logging library, which is commonly used by Java applications. In the Java ecosystem, there are a few common Java logging libraries, Logback, Log4j1, Log4j2. And so this vulnerability is in Log4j2. And this vulnerability has been present since September of 2013 to basically end of last year. So 8 years, it's been lying in wait. And and it was discovered by a security researcher with the Alibaba Cloud security team, reported to Apache. I think it was November 24th that this happened. And attackers got wind of it, started exploiting it on December 1st of last year. Then it started getting exploited in the Minecraft community. And then December 10th is when it just kind of blew open on Twitter, and then everyone found out and it kind of exploded. Now, what the vulnerability is specifically is it has to do with the way the Apache Log4j2 logging library processes data. And normally you think of logging libraries as, on the surface, you would think that it's pretty easy thing that it has to do. It just takes data and it writes it to disk, and that's it, right? And that's what you normally would expect for a logging library. However, if you've been in the enterprise, you know that there are a lot of complex requirements around logging. And one of the common practices is to enrich data that's logged with additional metadata. And so, a lot of SIM solutions also do this. And so what Log4j2 provides is a feature, or, in hindsight, a misfeature, where it'll look at the data that's being logged, and if there are certain format strings that are in that data, it will try to populate that format string with data from elsewhere. So think about, let's say you're logging a message and it's associated with a specific user ID. And now you want to also log some additional attributes about that user, like the name or that user's manager. And so what Log4j2 can do is it can take that user ID and it could do a lookup to a network system to fill in additional metadata. And so all that information then can be populated in one place. And so it's a convenience so that whoever's consuming that data downstream doesn't have to kind of correlate it or that kind of stuff later on. But that's exactly where the vulnerability came from, is the fact that this lookup was on by default. And what's even crazier is that people can control where those lookups are happening. So there's, which network resources it communicates with in order to do the lookup. So essentially, it's a very commonly used component. This vulnerability has been there for 8 years in Java applications. And all an attacker or end user needs to do is be able to craft some input that is logged by a Java application. And if they can control something that's logged, which is pretty much everything, all applications log lots of stuff, HTTP headers, URL paths, form fields, then you can trigger this vulnerability and exploit it. The worst case, you can get remote code execution, which has been proven in a lot of cases.
So interesting. So one thing I'll mention, this podcast is broadcasted live, and we are it's several different platforms. We're monitoring any questions that the audience may have. So if you do have some questions, please feel free to post them and share this with us. We'll be able to answer these hopefully live. And so what's different specifically about this vulnerability that made such an impact, aside from the fact it was released right before the holidays?
Yeah, it's the breadth of impact, right? It's any Java application that's using this common component that's vulnerable. And so this has been there for 8 years, this vulnerability. And any Java application, so there's thousands of Java applications out there, and especially in the enterprise. And so anything that was using this library, and there's only a handful of common logging libraries, is vulnerable. And the extent of vulnerability varies based on the application, the Java version. There's a lot of considerations there, but the breadth of impact is huge. So if you go back and look at vulnerabilities over the last 10 years, Eternal Blue was obviously huge, affected all Windows operating systems. Shell Shock, Heartbleed, it's kind of on that scale with potentially bigger impact.
And it was released before the holidays. Maybe talk to me about the anatomy of a vulnerability. What the phone ring. Maybe the CISO, maybe the executives are getting this in the news. What happens then? Somebody. I'm assuming, depending on the organization size, it kind of trickle from the top to the bottom, and then what do practitioners actually go ahead and do? What does that look like for them?
Yeah.
Go ahead. Jose, I can take that if Naveen, if you want to, provide some more. So when you think about as a defender, so one, you've got two dynamics in a shop, right? You've got the executives getting panicked because they see this news getting out there, and the first reaction is like, "Holy crap, are we in trouble? How is this going to affect us?" So as a practitioner, you've got the top-down pressure of prove to me we're not exploitable by the executives and by the board, which is very difficult to do, right? Prove the negative. And then the other side of it is you're still trying to figure it out yourself. And I think what makes Log4Shell so dangerous and so challenging is how pervasive it is across your organization. Yeah, for your custom applications, you can go do a search in your code repository and see that Log4j was being imported as a library. You can characterize the risk and threat and maybe update that library version for your custom applications. But it's all the packaged applications and the middleware and the infrastructure you have, whether it's your load balancer or your critical components like vRealize and vSphere and WebSphere and all the other products that are out there. You don't know what they have. Sometimes that dependency is buried 5, 6, 7, 10 layers deep, and you're not going to find it. And so as a practitioner, there are so many unknown unknowns that just wrapping your head around what is absolutely possible becomes in itself a daunting task while getting beat up by the executive. One of the questions in the stream here to reiterate is the attacker didn't have to do anything except craft a very simple string, $, open brace, JNDI, closed, brace, a couple of strings and a network path. That's it. And kind of like a SQL injection attack, there's nothing you've got to do on the database itself to exploit it in a SQL injection attack. You're just passing in the correct string to execute a query. Similarly here, there's nothing the attacker has to do behind the curtains. They just have to craft a string, find any input field anywhere, whether it's a login or a website or a shopping cart, pass in that string and spray and pray that somebody that it gets logged in and the callback occurs.
And it was also used in various different ways, right? We saw a couple exploits where companies got owned and basically, they got attacked by ransomware, for example, right? So there were a few cases already of initial exploitation, and there are IP addresses out there that are scanning the web for open vulnerabilities, specifically for Log4j. So let's talk a bit about kind of the best practices from your perspective, what you've seen that happened. What can the practitioners do in, what would that process look like over time? Because this is ongoing, right? So it's been maybe a month or so. We're going to do this again in one more month from now. What kind of progress are we making as an industry to circumvent this type of vulnerability?
If I may first, real quick, I actually will show you if this actually works. If you can see my screen.
Yep.
Naveen, I'm going to speak for Naveen for a moment and let him explain it. But just to give you a sense of what it means to exploit Log4Shell, and there's a blog post here. We'll have the team send out a link to really understand it. But if you look here, the only thing Naveen had to do was pass in this JNDI string. vRealize did the correct behavior. That's not a valid username and password. But Naveen, why don't you explain what happened on the back end? But for the audience to see, this is all it took to exploit vRealize, and this is happening. The National Health Services in the UK just put out a broadcast that VMware Horizon software that's internet exposable is being actively exploited within their environment and so on. But Naveen, you want to talk about this proof of concept that you demonstrated?
Yeah. I mean, so the mechanics of exploiting the vulnerability are kind of brain dead simple, which is why the impact is so, this is another complicating thing about why the impact is so broad, is it's so easy to exploit. So this specific application, VMware vRealize Operations Manager, which is commonly seen in the enterprise, all you need to do to exploit this vulnerable version is insert this format string, the JNDI string here, as the username in the username field, and try to log in. And this application happens to log this username in its logs. And when that happens, it takes that format string there and tries to interpret it. And in this string, you can see it calls back to a specific IP address, 10.0.220.200 on a port 1389. Again, it's kind of crazy that a user can control where these network lookups are happening, but that's exactly what's happening here. And so then when this is logged, the vRealize application will actually connect back to the attacker IP at 10.0.220.200, and it'll download some data. And this is a Java deserialization attack. So that data that's being provided is a serialized Java object from the attacker back to the vRealize application. It deserializes it. There's some commands encoded in there, and those attacker commands are run. And that's how an attacker can just trivially get shell on the vRealize instance here.
And on top of that, the this type of vulnerability is not necessarily exposed to internet, right? So it's not internet facing, so it would not necessarily get detected by open source intelligence type of tools, right? Is that correct?
I mean, it's used for both initial access. So as Snehal mentioned, VMware Horizon is actively being exploited, and it's usually internet facing. We just had a operation yesterday, a pen test, where we found this public facing for a client, and was able to exploit it and get remote code execution, and that was public facing. It's also used for lateral movement inside. So vCenter is already being targeted by like Conti ransomware groups. Like within a week, they weaponized that and are using it for lateral movement. So it's used both for initial access, public facing, as well as lateral movement internally.
So from your perspective as a practitioner, what is the kind of the best practices right now that ongoing that they can, somebody can start mitigating the risk associated, and where do they start? Like, how do you know, let's say you have a bunch of devices that are, affected. How do you know where to start? Like in terms of prioritization, in terms of like your infrastructure, to where to start in terms of mitigating?
Yeah, I can speak to that. So I would say, if you're starting today, knowing what we know now, first of all, if you've got VMware in your environment, which you probably do, specifically Horizon, vCenter, vRealize, anything VMware related, know that that's going to be a target because that is critical infrastructure. Attackers are actively exploiting that right now and have been doing it for the last few weeks. And attackers are going to continue to actively exploit it. So if you have anything VMware related, visit the VMSA security advisory, check which of those applications you have, and prioritize patching those because it's important. So starting with that, and then I would say for everything else, follow kind of your disciplined security process that you have in place for vulnerability management, which means you need to be able to find Log4Shell in your environment. And we can talk through that in more detail. How do you do that? So there's a couple of strategies based on host space scanning as well as network detection. I personally believe you want a combination of strategies to find it. Then you need to understand the impact. So with Log4Shell specifically, you can get remote code execution, but in a lot of cases, it might just be a simple information disclosure, meaning that all an attacker can do is get some properties from the host system, like the host name, operating system, and so forth. If they're lucky, they might be able to get AWS access keys in the environment and so forth. But most of the time, there's not much they can do with it. Then based off of understanding the impact, you can prioritize it for fixing along with all sorts of other serious vulnerabilities. Like just in December, at the same time as Log4Shell, there was a couple of Windows Active Directory vulnerabilities that were published called NOPAC. Really important. So Log4Shell got all the news, but in that was lost was, there's some other critical stuff out there that should also be prioritized and fixed. And then finally, after fixing it, so the process of fixing this can be complicated. Normally you'd go to the vendor, look at their advisory, see if you can patch it. If not, there's some procedures around updating the jar files or removing a specific class. It gets even more difficult if it's an older application that isn't really supported anymore. But then finally, assuming that you've been able to fix it, the last step is to verify and absolutely make sure it's fixed. So using tools that can actually validate that it's been really fixed, because we've seen a lot of scenarios where customers think they've fixed it and they try to use us again to see if it's gone, and they find it's still there for whatever reason. And it's complicated, the fix process for some of these applications and what to fix and where. So being able to verify is really important. So
I think building on Naveen's point, it was so easy and prolific. I mean, I grew up a Java developer in the enterprise when I worked at IBM on WebSphere. It is so easy to download the Log4j library and embed it in your application. There wasn't standardized logging at the app level in the 2000s and early 2010s and so on. People just logged on their own. And so, to Naveen's point, you might fix it in one place, but you don't know where else that library has been included. And it's going to take a lot of effort and testing and verifying exploitation to know where it is. The other part on the Defender side, and it's a straightforward to do if you have robust outbound network logging, is if you inject the JNDI command, it still has to make an outbound remote connection to some sort of nefarious server outside of your environment, or for the most part, unless they've already burrowed in your environment and it's going to be an outbound connection to an internal C2 server. That's a whole nother conversation. But it does have to connect outbound. And so if you've got robust border gateway type monitoring to look at all the outbound connections, you can look for odd activity on all outbound connections, whether enterprise-wide or specifically on components that you're concerned about, in order to try to catch effectively the beacon that's being pushed. So in addition to, I really like how Naveen described it, you've got host-based scanning, which is basically searching for every jar file, opening those jar files, and recursively unzipping every single Java artifact to find Log4j classes. And then from there, precisely remediating that class file, changing that configuration file, or upgrading that piece of software entirely. But that host-based scanning is going to give you a view. Network-based scanning is going to be effectively actively trying to exploit all of your web applications and products and services by dropping a JNDI type command in the way that you saw in the vRealize sample. And so if you take I'm going to monitor the beacons and any nefarious outbound connections, plus I'm going to do host-based scanning, plus I'm going to do network exploitation, the three of those together should get you pretty far.
Now, I would make a remark here that this whole area of patching and realizing that it wasn't actually patched, that's not unique to Log4j, right? That's not unique. There's a lot of areas where this whole patch management has been done, and then you do a scanning, and then you realize that maybe somehow the process was was stopped halfway through, or for whatever reason the system reported that being patched, but it hasn't been patched. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'll give you an example. We work with a medical facility, and they had applied patches for zero logon. Another vulnerability Naveen can go into on how dangerous this thing is. It was a 10 out of 10 from CISA, big deal. And they had applied patches, and for 18 months they had reported that patch was successfully applied to their regulators and controllers and all the other aspects of healthcare oversight. Well, when they ran a pen test with us in our Node Zero product, we were able to successfully exploit zero logon in their environment. And the customer's like, there is no way this is exploitable. No way. We patched it. Look, Microsoft says it's patched. Qualys says it's patched. And so I kind of describe it as bloodlust, but the look in Naveen's eyes and Zach Hanley's eyes, another guy on the team, of like, hold my beer, I'm going to prove to you that this is exploitable. And they went off, logged in with their consent, and exploited it. and the customer nearly fell out of their chair. Well, it turns out after some investigation that when they applied the patch, the registry keys in Windows or whatever were successfully changed, but the binary itself was blocked by Cylance. So while the registry keys showed patch, the actual binary never changed. And so they were reporting successful for 18 months, but they were exploitable that entire time. And if you exploit zero logon, you get domain admin, you get keys to the kingdom. And now you've got to worry about threat actors that have already burrowed in your system, and now you need to spend time doing forensics and ripping things apart. So what this customer did was, in addition to Patch Tuesday, they have now created Pen Test Wednesday, where they run the Node Zero pen tests after they've applied all their patches to verify that the patches have successfully been applied.
So maybe now's the time to talk about what is Node Zero and what does it do, and then potentially how can Horizon 3 specifically help customers and your customers and potential customers to protect themselves and mitigate that particular vulnerability. I don't know if you want to jump in.
This is all you. This is your baby.
So Node Zero is it's our autonomous pen testing solution. So I'll speak in general, and we can talk specifically about Log4Shell as well. So it's modeled after what human pen testers do, and it's built by. We have a fantastic team of red teamers and pen testers who have been doing this for many years. And so what a human pen tester does when they do a traditional internal pen test is they will bring in their laptop running some sort of pen testing operating system like Kali or Parrot OS. They'll plug in and then they'll start going through the normal pen testing process, which involves enumeration, discovering assets on the network, looking for open ports and services, fingerprinting applications, identifying misconfigurations and vulnerabilities, and then they begin the process of actually exploiting different things. And from the systems they exploit, they try to extract information like credentials. And there's a normal methodology and process they follow. But all along the way, they're gathering information and they're making connections between different pieces of information and then deciding what follow-on action to take. And they're doing this repeatedly until they achieve some sort of end state kind of impact, like they've compromised the entire domain, they have access to all your data, and then they can present that as a critical business impact. And so what Node Zero does is it follows exactly that same process. So what a human pen tester does, I think on the surface, it seems like hackers and pen testers, there's some sort of art or black magic behind it, but it's a very methodical process. And pen testers have scripts and tools that they use. We've taken all of that based on our knowledge of all the tooling out there and the tools that we write, and we package that up as our autonomous pen testing solution. And we follow that same process to completion and ultimately producing a report showing the impact that we had. Now, for Log4Shell specifically, Node Zero will try to find it on the network using network-based detection. So initially, we're detecting based on DNS-based callbacks. We fuzz applications based on HTTP headers, paths, and form fields. We also look for application-specific signatures, so known applications and how to exploit them. Our team internally also actively is pulling down applications that are of high value and exploiting them, and then encoding those signatures into our product as well. So it's a combination of both fuzzing as well as application-specific signatures, and both are valuable. We've encountered some interesting cases where the thing you're fuzzing is actually not where the vulnerability is, because Log4Shell, it's kind of a data problem. It's not exactly the application you're fuzzing. So we had a case where we were fuzzing a Python application, which isn't vulnerable to Log4Shell, but it was generating a log message that was getting processed downstream by Logstash, which is Java-based. And this was public-facing on the internet. And so it was Logshell somewhere, Logstash, somewhere internal that was actually getting exploited. So Node 0 can be used to discover that kind of stuff. And then Node 0 will try to exploit Log4Shell. And so like I mentioned, there's information disclosure impact as well as remote code execution. So Node 0 will try to go through, just like an attacker would, standing up some malicious LDAP servers and HTTP server. It'll try to leak as much information as it can, and then it will try to prove that it could execute code remotely on that system. So just going through that whole process. And ultimately, that's surfaced up in the impact that you can see in the report at the end, what was actually possible. And then, as a security operator, then you can judge what you want to do with that.
So Snehal, is the last pen tester been born already? So
That's a great question. I'm a big believer in human-machine teaming. So when you think about one, let's talk about layered security testing for a moment. There are several. You got to think about your security testing from different perspectives. You have I am an unauthenticated internal user. From that perspective, what damage can be done? And you can use autonomous pen testing to have a very robust understanding of your critical impacts from that perspective. I am an unauthenticated external user. From that perspective, what critical impact can be achieved? And that's going to tell you something different. Or I am from this subnet, my customer support subnet, or my trusted zone where the mainframe is subnet, or so on. And then you've got other perspectives. I'm going to give no notice to the SOC, and I want to measure their reaction time. How quickly did they detect the adversary was in the network, or lateral movement, and so on. Or I'm going to actually do yes notice to the SOC, so we can collaborate to identify holes in our tools, missing logs in our seams, and so on and so forth. All of that is probably the most important first layer of security testing that organizations need to go off and apply. And those are actually the 4 perspectives that Node 0 focuses on and specializes in. Unauthenticated internal and try to detect lateral movement. Unauthenticated external to try to detect things like breaching your perimeter. No notice against the SOC to measure their reaction time. Yes notice to the SOC to establish a purple team type culture or red and blue working together. After that, where you want to start to get into is an attacker is going, as they invest time in studying your custom software, they're going to look for your app-specific 0 days. That takes a tremendous amount of investment by the attacker to find that for you. And machines are not very good at finding custom 0 days in source code because of the logic that's required to understand race conditions and memory leaks and all the other things. Now, static security testing tools can help. Dynamic security testing tools for apps can help. But humans are going to be much better at finding those custom code 0 days, which is why we have such a robust ethical hacker ecosystem in the industry. And what they're really good at is identifying custom 0 days in source code. That will always be, I think, or for foreseeable future, a human-driven process. So what I see is this model where you use machines or algorithms and autonomous pen testing like us to find, fix, and verify both breadth and depth of your organization through those perspectives I described. And then you use the human to probe very deeply in identifying very specific 0 days or very specific complex conditions that require the power of human correlation to identify. And it's the combination of those that I think will give you the best layered security testing coverage. I don't know, does that, Naveen, kind of align with your expectations and thoughts?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, I think the machine is going to get better and better over time, and it's going to raise the bar. But I think there's always going to be that human component and those app-specific 0 days that, I can't imagine a future where a machine is just going to do it all. Maybe that's going to happen someday, but over time, the machine is going to be raising that bar for humans and doing more and more.
So how do you keep innovating in this space to make sure that because it's a moving target, right? There's Log4j right now, but there's hopefully not, but something else is going to come up in the future, and the whole pen testing methodologies are constantly changing. So how do you, as a company, innovate in making sure you're on top of kind of the latest methodologies, systems, and so on, and make sure that you're on top of it when kind of the next next iteration of the next exploit, you already be ready for it? How do you do that?
If I start, I see kind of three parts to this answer, and I'll talk about the first two and tee up the third one for Naveen. So the first part here is, think about when IBM played Garry Kasparov in chess. IBM didn't hard code 40 million chess games and say, oh, Gary must be playing game number 332. What IBM did was look at every piece on the chessboard and determine the next best action. And that next best action to win, or in this case, achieve an outcome. And so we've got well understood outcomes in the pen testing or offensive security side. Can I achieve domain administrator? Can I compromise a domain user? Can I compromise a host? Can I get right access to your data? There's about 10 or so, maybe 20 critical impact outcomes. And in any given move, what is the next best action to help a path towards that outcome? And so one of the things that we built were adaptive algorithms capable of identifying the next best action. So you don't have to hard code all of these attack paths like hard coding chess games. The product and the capability itself is adaptive in nature. That's why it's autonomous. It's adaptive versus automated, which is hard coded and described. So that's kind of like part one. The other part of how we stay ahead, actually, I'll tee up Naveen a little bit on for this next one, only because I forgot my second point. It'll come back to me in a moment. But Naveen, when you think about the ability to rapidly take a 0 day and put it into the system, and kind of that methodology of having the right architecture and how quickly we're able to do that. You want to talk a little bit more about that? And then I did remember my third point, and then come back to me after.
And by the way, I love this because this is a live session. So any blips or whatever, that's greatly appreciated. So, the audience see we're not pre-recording this. So much appreciated, Snehal. Go ahead, Naveen.
Yeah. So as Snehal mentioned, our architecture, it's really a platform. Writing and introducing a specific exploit for something like Log4Shell is not a whole big new thing that we need to introduce. It's something that you do and you plug in, and then it kind of follows the normal pattern of, okay, now if you can exploit it, you can get remote code execution, then what are the follow-on steps from there? So we're not, obviously there's going to be new vulnerabilities, new exploits, and if they're big ones that people are exploiting, then we want to put it into the product, but it's not a huge effort to do that.
Go ahead, Naveen. I didn't turn you off.
I was just going to add that I think the question is a little bit phrased in a way that it's focused on vulnerabilities. And vulnerabilities are very important, right? And it's important to stay on top of them. Log4Shell is huge. But one thing to keep in mind is that attackers are commonly exploiting other ways to get into your environment. Vulnerabilities is just one piece of it. So we find that credential attacks are huge. And there's no vulnerabilities here. Attackers are just finding credentials, logging in, moving around laterally in an environment, or there could be some misconfiguration. They're exploiting that. And those are timeless. Those are not like, the next new vulnerability. Those are common techniques, proven, they've been doing over and over. And so we run in environments and we're not really focused on, one vulnerability or two vulnerabilities. We're focused on kind of systemic issues where we might have gotten in through a vulnerability and got a credential, but then we could use that credential to pivot all over your network and then eventually get domain admin privileges. And that's what, you'll see ransomware attackers do. They're not only focused on, vulnerabilities. They're focused on everything holistically. And those are timeless. And that's what we're building into our product.
Yeah, if you kind of build on Naveen's points, attackers don't have to hack in like you see in the movies using 0 days. They often just log in because all it took was one employee to reuse their Netflix password for their corporate email, and that Netflix password ended up in some breach database somewhere or off on the dark web, and now you've got a valid password to reuse. And once you're in, from there you're going to be able to maneuver around that. Back to this chess analogy. When Naveen talked about when we first started an autonomous pen test, there are a set of basic moves that we do. We start to identify everything that's network reachable. We start fingerprinting all the host ports and services. We start identifying, say, the printer. Can we do an SNMP walk and pull out credentials? are there misconfigurations in Jenkins or VMware that we can start to take advantage of? For instance, if you don't encrypt your VMware backups, then you can find a very specific MTD file, parse the binary, and pull out the admin credentials. That's a misconfig. That's not a vulnerability that a vulnerability scanner is going to go off and identify. And so similar to chess, there is a well-defined set of opening moves. And so in pen testing, there is a well-defined set of opening moves. And then from there, you're going to play the middle game and eventually the finish. And then similarly in pen testing, there's going to be a variety of middle game options based on what you've uncovered. And then you're going to find the finish to achieve each of those outcomes. But what I wanted to bring up as my final point on kind of where pen testing is going, in 7 minutes and 19 seconds, Node Zero fully compromised a bank. That bank had every Gucci security tool you could purchase, yet not a single security alert was triggered in that 7 minutes and 19 seconds. Because in security and defense, we don't have a tools problem. We don't need to go buy the next AI-based SIM tool or the next AI-based EDR tool. We have an effectiveness problem. We've got tons of tools on the defensive side, but they weren't designed to work together, and they require a significant amount of integration and tuning to achieve. So if in 7 minutes and 19 seconds, we went from unauthenticated user to domain admin and didn't trigger a single alert, well, the first question is, how do we trigger those alerts? But if you fast forward, in a year or two, we should be able to do that in 2 minutes, not 7 minutes. And maybe a couple years after that, we'll be able to do it in less than a minute. In less than a minute, can a human detect observe the alerts, understand the alerts, characterize the risk of those alerts, identify what playbook or runbook to execute to stifle the attack in progress, get permission to run that playbook, and then stifle the attack? There is no way a human's going to be able to do that in 60 seconds in a large, complex environment. And so what we have is autonomous or algorithmic attack. And as Conti and other ransomware organizations start to weaponize the treasure trove of training data they've accrued through all of their ransomware attacks and so on, they will start to weaponize autonomous attacks. The human defender becomes the bottleneck. And so really the question is going to be, if I fast forward, say 5 years in security, how do we have, the future of cyber warfare becomes algorithms fighting algorithms with humans by exception, because humans simply can't make defensive decisions fast enough to stifle an algorithmic attack that's making 100,000x more decisions per minute.
I think as an industry, we're just lucky that the Horizon 3 is on the defender side, and not selling your services to the other side. And speaking of industry, I think I saw a comment here from the audience saying, how great it was where the industry came together and offered, services to detect and, potentially find out those vulnerabilities in the infrastructure, which is pretty amazing to coming together and helping out. And then, so we're running towards the end of the time we have allotted here today, and we'll, I feel like we have to do this again sometime soon. We'll cover additional topics and so on. But I would like to kind of, finish in a kind of light note. So one of the things that is also amazing about this cybersecurity industry is how creative they are in creating some of these, memes that are associated with, with this particular, vulnerabilities, but then also for others, very, very creative. And some of them are, highly recommend looking at some of these. Very, very creative. I don't know if you have any comments on some of these, some of these memes that came out, and there's hundreds of them almost, I feel like. So, there's a couple ones that I really like. This one in particular. As we before we part ways, what's the easiest way for people to reach out to you for additional insight? Potentially look at the offering, advice, whatever they want to get from you. What's the easiest way to reach you?
Yeah, I'll chime in. So Horizon3.ai is the website was designed not to be a commercial website, but much more about educational and informative. Back to your point, the community. The power of the community is so important that how do we provide as much information as possible, and it's less about trying to hawk product at you as much as it is trying to inform you and educate you on different types of use cases. So the website is probably the best place. And actually, one of the things, just real quick, I'll show you the website, and I'll have Naveen talk about it briefly, just because it's awesome. I describe a lot of people in security as ethical hacking curious, which means they know OSCP and they're not ready to hack, but they're very intrigued. And so one of the things that Naveen put together on the website under blogs, under I am Node Zero, is Hack the Box is an excellent learning platform for ethical hackers. And these are various Hack the Box ranges that you could go log into and try to exploit yourself that Node Zero was used to compromise. And what you'll see is about 95% of this blog post was auto-written by the algorithms. The final 5% were Naveen and our marketing team making pretty for the web. But what you'll see is the actual step-by-step. In this case, this box was compromised in 3 minutes. What was the kill chain or the attack path? And then what was every step the algorithms took and every decision they made in order to compromise this particular box? And what this will help you do as a defender is understand offense. And that's something, Naveen, you can talk about your experience when we first brought you in, when we first connected with you on this frustration that most people that are security defenders have no real experience looking at the world from the offensive standpoint. So it limits their effectiveness. But if you take the time as a defender to understand the offensive side of the house, it makes you a better defender. You don't have to hack, but you have to understand the tactics, and it'll make you a better defender. And I really hope that I see more of the industry cross that line and bridge that divide so that offense is used to inform defense.
Absolutely. Snehal, thank you. And Naveen, do you have any parting words?
No, I mean, to Snehal's point, that speaks to my personal journey. So, being a developer, I worked on defensive security products for most of my career. And then it was about 5 years ago that I kind of had an epiphany, and I was wondering, well, all these products I've been working on, do they actually work or do anything useful for customers that I'm building these products for? So I took a personal journey to really understand the offensive side, and tons of self-learning, and then fortunate to link up with Snehal and Tony at Horizon 3. And it's really like the perspective you get when you start really getting deep into offensive security is very different than the defensive perspective. And it's really important to merge those two sides so that defenders really understand the offensive side. We get defensive tools able to keep up with attackers, because I'll be honest, right now, attackers have all the advantage. And we're seeing that, every single day. So closing that gap is really important.
Thank you very much. That was very impactful. Thank you very much for joining, Naveen and Snehal. Thank you for taking the time to chat with us today. Thanks for all who joined. Stay safe out there, and looking forward to seeing you in the next session. Take care all.